It's standing at the tree line, maybe 150 yards out. And it's looking directly at him, not scanning the clearing, not following a scent trail, looking at him. Specifically, like it already knew he was there and had decided this was the moment to stop pretending it didn't. Dark hair covering everything, arms, legs, face, all of it. An open crossing of a clearing in full daylight with no attempt at concealment, like whatever calculation a creature like this normally runs. Stay hidden, stay back, stay away, had been switched off, like it had made a decision. He raises his rifle, not to shoot, instinct. He puts his eye to the scope, and for a second or two he sees the face clearly, and then he lowers the gun. He told me he can't describe what he saw in full, only that it was not human, and it was not afraid, and it was still coming. It stops 25, 30 feet away. It stands there in the cold morning air, and it looks at him, and it waits. And then he shouts at it, demands to know what it is, what it wants, and after a long pause, it does something he will spend the next 2 years trying to explain. It speaks, one word, in English, costume. That is the account I was sent, and it is the strangest, most unsettling, most cognitively disturbing Bigfoot encounter I have ever come across. The man who experienced it asked me not to use his name. I've honored that. What I can tell you is that by the time you understand the full sequence of what happened that morning, the words, the logic behind them, and what came after, the question of whether Bigfoot is real is going to feel like the least interesting question in the room.
Hi, I'm Alex, the researcher and writer behind these videos. YouTube has been a lot more strict with small creators recently, so I just wanted to introduce myself and to please ask you to consider subscribing. Hope you enjoy watching this one.
The man I'm going to call the witness is not the kind of person who goes looking for Bigfoot stories. He's a seasoned hunter who has been going into the same stretch of remote forest every autumn for close to 15 years. He knows that land the way you know your own backyard, the trails, the creek beds, the tree lines, the way the light changes at different times of day. He's tracked and killed deer, elk, and bear in that terrain. He is not someone who mistakes a shadow for a monster or a blown branch for something sinister. He sent me a message through the channel, which is where most of these accounts start. It was longer than the typical submission and written in a way that was careful and specific. He wasn't embellishing, wasn't trying to sell me on anything. He laid it out almost like a report. Date, time, weather conditions, what he was doing when it started. The detail was the thing that first caught my attention. People making things up tend to go wide. They give you drama and atmosphere. What he gave me was precise. He told me from the start that he didn't want publicity, didn't want his name in the title, didn't want anyone coming to his hunting area with cameras and podcasts. He just wanted someone who took this seriously to have the account on record. He'd been carrying it for a while. It was, in his words, eating at him. He's not a Bigfoot believer, was not at the time of the encounter. He'd heard the stories the way anyone who spends time in wilderness hears them. Campfire noise, local color, the kind of thing that gets more dramatic every time it's retold. He gave them the same amount of credit he gives most campfire stories, which is to say, none. It was a late October morning. He'd gone in before dawn, which is standard. You want to be positioned and settled before first light. The walk-in was normal. Cold, clear, still. He described the air as sharp, that specific bite you get in the mountains when the temperature drops overnight and hasn't lifted yet. He was in good spirits. It was the kind of morning that reminds you why you go through the effort. He settled into a spot he'd used for years, a slight rise overlooking a natural clearing with a creek running through the far edge, ideal position. He got comfortable, got still, and waited. And that's when the first thing he noticed that was wrong. The birds, or rather the absence of them. Now, if you spent any real time in the woods, you know that total silence is not natural. A forest is a living system, and it has a constant low hum of noise. Birdsong, small animals moving through leaf litter, wind shifting branches. Total silence means something has suppressed it, usually a predator. He sat with it for a few minutes, told himself it was probably nothing, maybe a hawk passing through. He'd felt this kind of quiet before. But this was different in a way he struggled to describe clearly to me. He said it felt heavier than a hawk, like the forest had pulled in a breath and was holding it. He'd felt alert before in the woods. That hunter's instinct when the game is close. This wasn't that. This was something else. A low-grade unease that he couldn't locate or explain, spreading from his gut outward. Then the smell hit him. He knows bear, he knows skunk, he knows rotting deer and wet dog and the particular funk of a muddy creek in autumn. This was none of those things. He described it as layered, a top note of something almost musky, animal, and underneath it something sharper, like the smell of a person who has been in the wilderness for weeks without bathing, but amplified, magnified to a degree that was almost physical. He pulled his neck gaiter up over his nose instinctively. He scanned the tree line. Nothing. He checked his downwind side, because smell that strong means proximity. Still nothing he could see. He told himself it was a bear that had moved through recently. He settled back and kept his eyes on the clearing, but the unease didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. He saw it emerge from the tree line at the far edge of the clearing, near the creek. His first thought, and he was very clear about this, was that it was a man. A large man, heavily built, wearing dark clothing. That's the brain's first reach. It grabs the most available explanation and applies it. But within seconds, the explanation stopped working because the figure was too tall. Not basketball player tall, not linebacker tall. Tall in a way that registered as wrong before he could intellectually process why it was wrong. He estimated it later at somewhere between 8 and 9 feet. The shoulders were broad enough to make the height look proportional rather than freakish. The whole frame was scaled up, not just the height. It was covered, dark, dense, fur or hair. He couldn't determine at distance whether it was matted or coarse, only that it covered everything, arms, legs, face, all of it. The face he couldn't read at that range. He was maybe 150 yards out and using no optics. His rifle scope was slung, not raised. The thing that locked him up completely was the way it moved. It wasn't rushing, it wasn't fleeing, it was walking toward him at a pace that felt deliberate. Not aggressive, not panicked, purposeful. He used that word more than once when he described it. Purposeful, like it had somewhere to be, and that somewhere was him. It crossed the clearing in the open without any apparent concern about concealment, moving on 2 legs, arms swinging with the gait, in a way that was wrong for a human, but not right for any animal he could name. He raised his rifle, not to shoot, he was clear about that. Instinct. When something large is closing distance and you have a rifle, you raise it. He put his eye to the scope and for the first time got a clear look at the face. He told me he only held it there for a second or two before he lowered the gun. What he saw in those 2 seconds he didn't describe in detail, only that it was not human and it was looking directly at him, not scanning, not hunting by scent, looking at him specifically. It stopped approximately 25 to 30 feet away. It stood there. And it did something he had not anticipated in any version of this moment he might have imagined. It waited. He shouted at it. He said his first instinct was to challenge it. Fill the silence, assert himself, see how it responded. He yelled something to the effect of, "What are you? What do you want? Who's out here?" standard things a person shouts when they're frightened and trying not to show it. It didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't run. It absorbed the noise and held its ground and looked at him. And then, after a pause that he described as lasting several seconds, it spoke. One word, costume. He said later that the voice was the most wrong thing about the whole encounter. Not because it was loud or monstrous, it wasn't. It was low, resonant in a way that seemed to come from a chest cavity much larger than a human's. The word itself was clearly formed, correctly pronounced, but the register of it, the physical quality of the sound, did not come from a human body. He was certain of that. He'd hunted next to enough men, stood close to enough voices in enough conditions to know that. This was not a voice produced by a human larynx. He stood there processing it. Then he asked the only thing that made sense to ask, "What do you mean, costume?" It looked at him. Another pause, then, "Fun!" That was the exchange. He pushed harder, asked why it was here, what it wanted, where it came from. He got nothing back to those questions, just the same patient, unreadable silence. He asked if it could understand him. Nothing. He asked again about the costume. Nothing. He asked why it had said fun. And this time he got something, a slight tilt of the head. Not an answer, an acknowledgement. Like it had heard the question and was choosing not to respond to it. He told me the silence between the words was more disturbing than the words themselves, because the words were so precisely chosen. Costume, fun, not random vocalizations, not mimicry of something it had overheard. These were communicative words. They were deployed in direct response to his presence, and they were doing something specific. They were deflecting. Costume dismissed the question of what it was. Fun dismissed the question of why it was there. Two words that closed two lines of inquiry simultaneously. He asked it directly, "Are you a Bigfoot?" And it said nothing. He told me he read the silence as neither confirmation nor denial, just the choice not to answer. And that choice felt considered.
Here's my honest read on those two words. Costume is a lie, a deliberate, calibrated lie. It chose that word because it knew, somehow, that the word would create doubt inside a human mind. That's not instinct. That's a theory of mind. That's understanding how another creature perceives the world and using that understanding as a tool, as a weapon.
I've turned this over more times than I can count, and I keep arriving at the same place. An animal does not lie. A conditioned animal might repeat a word. It learned, got a reward. But this was not repetition. It was deployment. The word was produced in context in response to a specific question for a specific purpose. Chimpanzees have demonstrated the ability to deceive in controlled studies. Orangutans have been documented concealing information from researchers, but those are controlled environments, years of conditioning. This was wild, spontaneous, immediate. That gap is significant. He's not entirely sure what triggered it. He thinks it might have been the moment he took a step forward. He'd been standing still through the whole exchange, and when he shifted his weight and moved, maybe 2-3 feet closer, something changed. He described it as a change in the quality of the air before anything visual happened. The stillness that had been a held breath became something else. He registered it as threat before he saw any movement. It came fast. That was what he kept coming back to when he recounted it. The speed. Something that large should not be able to close 25 feet that quickly. He had no time to raise the rifle, no time to backpedal, no time to make any decision at all. He was on the ground before he had processed that it had moved. He wasn't struck the way you'd expect from a predator attack. No claws, no teeth, nothing that went for his throat or his face. What he described was more like being taken down. Controlled force, overwhelming weight, and then stillness. He was on his back, pinned momentarily, and he told me that in that moment he was completely certain he was going to die. Not because of what was being done to him, but because of what could be done. The sheer physical reality of what was holding him down was so far beyond his own strength that resistance was not a thought he could even form. It let him up. That was it. He was down, and then he wasn't. By the time he had gotten his bearings and scrambled to his feet, it was gone. He heard movement in the trees, not running, not crashing through brush the way a startled animal does. Walking. Back into the woods at the same deliberate pace it had arrived. His rifle was on the ground beside him. His pack was undisturbed. He was bruised along his ribs and had torn his jacket on a route going down. Nothing was broken, nothing was taken. He sat on the ground for a long time before he could make himself move. He didn't go to a hospital immediately. He drove home, sat in his truck in his own driveway for an hour, and then went inside and told his wife he'd slipped on a creek bank. She believed him. He's a private man, and she's used to him coming back from hunting trips with the odd bruise and not a lot of explanation. He did eventually go to a clinic a few days later when the rib pain wasn't improving. Bruised ribs, nothing cracked. The doctor asked how it happened. He said he fell. He sat in his truck on the way home and tried to apply the same methodical thinking he uses for tracking. Lay out what you know, strip out what you assumed, look at what remains. What he knew, something very large, approached him with intent. It spoke 2 English words in direct response to his questions. It made physical contact with overwhelming speed and force. It walked away. In the order those things happened, each step required the previous one to make sense, and none of them could be explained by a bear, a hoax, a hallucination, or a man in a costume. What he couldn't explain away so easily was what was happening in his head in the days that followed. He replayed the encounter constantly, not looking for errors in his memory, but because he couldn't stop. The words kept cycling through: costume, fun, the tilt of the head when he asked about fun, the speed of the movement, and then the deliberate slowness of the retreat. He was trying to build a framework that could hold all of those things together, and every framework he reached for fell apart. He'd processed animal encounters before. Bear encounters have a logic. You understand the bear's motivation, its fear response or aggression response, even if it's terrifying in the moment. There is an animal logic running underneath it that you can reconstruct afterward. This had no such logic, or rather, it had a logic he couldn't access. Whatever calculus produced costume and fun, and then produced that takedown, and then produced that controlled walk back into the woods. He couldn't read it, and not being able to read it was the thing that stayed with him. He also couldn't shake the physical memory of what being in proximity to that creature had felt like. Not the pain of going down, the presence of it during the seconds it was close. He described it as a kind of pressure, not just physical, but atmospheric, like standing too close to something operating at a frequency he wasn't built to process. Some researchers have attributed this quality of encounter, the overwhelming physical sensation, the almost paralytic quality of proximity, to infrasound. Large primates, including gorillas, are capable of producing infrasound in the low frequency range that affects human neurological functions. If Bigfoot shares that capacity and has developed it further, it would explain a consistent feature of close encounter reports that otherwise reads as exaggeration. He told me he started researching after about a week. He didn't look for Bigfoot content specifically at first. He went looking for primate cognition, chimpanzee communication studies, orangutan problem-solving research, great ape social behavior. He read about theory of mind experiments, about documented deception in captive primates, about the gap between what we know ape intelligence is capable of and what we've historically assumed it is capable of. And the more he read, the more the encounter started to make a specific kind of terrible sense. Let's sit with this for a moment, because I think it's the most important part of the whole account. Costume is not a distress call. It is not a territorial sound. It is not mimicry of something overheard in the abstract. It is a word used in direct response to a question about identity, deployed specifically to create confusion. If something can understand that a human is asking what it is and can choose a word that redirects that question without answering it, you are dealing with a level of cognitive sophistication that most mainstream biology doesn't want to assign to an undocumented primate. Fun is stranger and in some ways more disturbing, because fun implies a subjective state. It implies that the creature has a sense of enjoyment, that it approached this encounter as a kind of entertainment. The word, if used intentionally, suggests the whole interaction was chosen. The approach, the conversation, even the takedown. If fun was the frame, then all of it was deliberate play, not predation, not territorial defense. Something more complex and more troubling than either of those things. There's a documented body of research on primate deception that most people don't know about. Coco the gorilla was documented concealing her own wrongdoing by blaming other individuals. Santino, a chimpanzee at a Swedish zoo, was observed calmly collecting and stockpiling stones in the mornings to throw at visitors later in the day, planning for a future event, which requires mental simulation of what has not yet happened. Orangutans in Borneo have been documented adopting behavior specifically when being observed by researchers that they abandon when they believe they are unwatched, indicating an awareness of being monitored and the capacity to modify behavior accordingly. These are animals we have access to in controlled environments with years of study behind them. A creature that has never been formally studied, that lives in remote wilderness, and has presumably spent millennia avoiding human contact, could reasonably be expected to have developed its own sophisticated strategies for managing human encounters. Costume fits that framework. It's not a random sound, it's a management strategy. There's also the question of where the English came from, and I don't have a clean answer to that. The most likely explanation is exposure. A creature with good hearing, excellent memory, and years spent in proximity to human activity could plausibly have absorbed enough language to deploy isolated words. That's not as far-fetched as it sounds when you consider that great apes in controlled studies have demonstrated the ability to learn and use sign language not just as trained behavior, but generatively, combining known signs in new ways to express new ideas. A creature with superior cognitive capacity doing something similar with an overheard language is not impossible. It's uncomfortable, but it's not impossible. I want to be careful here because this is territory that even serious Bigfoot researchers tend to approach with caution. But if you go deep into the BFRO database, and I mean deep past the front page cases into the historical archive, you find a thread that runs through a small but consistent subset of reports. Language, not full sentences, not conversations, fragments, single words. Names shouted back at the person who used them. Whistles returned with perfect accuracy, sounds mimicked with a quality that witnesses consistently describe as too precise. Not an echo, not an animal, but something that understood what it was reproducing. The pattern isn't dominant in the literature, but it's persistent. It keeps appearing across different decades, different regions, different witnesses who have no contact with each other. There's a category of report that researchers sometimes call knock and whistle encounters. Witnesses deep in wilderness who produce sounds, either deliberately as a research method or accidentally through camp noise, and receive structured responses, not random noise back, patterned response, call and answer. The same number of knocks returned, or a whistle that matches pitch and duration with a precision that rattles the person producing it. Experienced investigators who have spent hundreds of nights in the field describe this phenomenon with a discomfort they usually reserve for the encounters themselves, because the implication is one they don't always want to spell out. Something out there is listening and choosing how to respond. Indigenous traditions across North America have long attributed a sophisticated social and cognitive life to these creatures. And it's worth sitting with the fact that these traditions emerged over thousands of years of cohabitation with whatever is in those forests. The Lummi, the Salish, the Lakota, the Choctaw, across completely distinct cultures with no shared language or origin, you find consistent descriptions of a being that does not merely exist in the wilderness, but navigates it with purpose and social structure. Not a monster, not purely an animal. Something in between, something that thinks, that has relationships, that appears to make deliberate decisions about when to be seen and when not to be. That cross-cultural consistency is not noise, that is signal. The late Jeff Meldrum, who spent decades as the field's most credentialed scientific defender, spent much of his later career focused on foot morphology and dermal ridge evidence. The physical, measurable data. But in interviews and lectures over the years, he was consistently careful not to dismiss the cognitive question. He noted that the behavioral evidence taken as a whole suggests a creature operating at a level of intelligence well above what a simple ape would require for survival. His work, now historical record, remains the most rigorous academic framework we have for engaging with this question seriously. There are also accounts, fewer in number but notable for their consistency of detail, of Bigfoot appearing to deliberately perform for witnesses, approaching in a way that seemed calibrated to create a specific reaction, retreating in a controlled manner that didn't suggest fear, returning to the same area at intervals in ways that felt less like coincidence and more like intention. The word that multiple independent witnesses have used is theatrical, like it knew it was being watched and was making choices about what to do with that knowledge. That word, theatrical, lands very differently after you've heard the word costume used in context.
But here's the part of the story I did not really expect. He told me that he still hunts that area, every season and every same stretch of forest.
He told me he went back the following autumn fully expecting not to see it again. Most encounters are one-time events, and he knew that. But he went back with something he didn't have before: attention. He started reading the forest differently, noticing things he'd previously filtered out, unusual structures in the trees, stick formations, the particular silence that he now knows precedes something large. He's begun keeping a log, which he shared parts of with me. He hasn't had a second direct encounter, but he's documented enough anomalies in that area over 2 seasons that he's convinced the territory is actively used by at least one, possibly more. He's found tree breaks, large branches snapped at heights that rule out wind or bear. Arranged in patterns he can't explain, he's found depressions in soft ground that don't match any known track. He's heard the whistles at distances that make his skin crawl when he remembers what he knows now about the mimicry behavior. He told me the thing that drives him back is not bravado. He's not going back to prove something to himself or to anyone else. He's going back because he has a question that the first encounter opened up and didn't answer. Not what is it? He's made his peace with that. The question he's carrying is simpler and more unsettling. Why me? Out of all the seasons he spent in that forest, across all the days he moved through what was clearly its territory, it chose that particular morning to approach. It chose to speak. It chose specific words, and then it chose to stop. He's also started leaving things. Not bait, He was clear that he's not trying to lure anything, and he understands the safety implications of deliberately attracting a creature of that size and unpredictability. What he leaves are markers, deliberate arrangements of stones, of sticks, of objects placed in patterns at the edge of the territory he now thinks of as shared. He can't say whether anything is responding to them. Some have been disturbed in ways that could be wind or small animals. One arrangement, a careful stack of 5 flat stones, was taken entirely. Ground cleared, no debris, simply gone. He's not drawing conclusions, he's asking questions in the only language available to him. He thinks it was a test, he can't prove that. But the logic of the encounter, if you follow it all the way through, the deliberate approach, the communication, the physical demonstration of power, and then the controlled withdrawal, reads less like a territorial dispute and more like an assessment. He wants to understand what he was being assessed for, and whether he passed, and if he didn't, he wants to know what passing looks like, because whatever is out there in that forest had a reason for speaking to him, and he is not willing to accept that the conversation is over. I've been covering Bigfoot for a while now, and if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you know I try not to tell you what to think. I lay out the evidence, I flag the gaps, and I let you make your own call. But I want to give you my honest read on this one because this account shook something loose in the way I think about these creatures. The standard framework for Bigfoot, the one even most believers operate from, treats them as a large, undiscovered primate. Smart in the way a great ape is smart, elusive, territorial, probably not that different cognitively from a gorilla or a chimp. That framework is comfortable because it keeps the creature in a category we understand. It's an animal, a big, impressive, hidden animal, but an animal. What this encounter describes is something operating outside that framework, not just physically large and physically capable, but socially and linguistically and strategically capable in ways that don't fit the comfortable category. A creature that lies. A creature that chooses specific words for specific effects. A creature that plays. A creature that assesses. That's not a gorilla. That's something that has been sharing this continent with us and watching us long enough to understand how we think. And I personally find that far more extraordinary and far more worth taking seriously than anything a trail cam has ever captured. The footage gets you a shape in the dark. This account gets you something behind the eyes. Whether you believe this witness or not is your call. I believe him. Not because I want the story to be true, but because the details he got right are the wrong ones to get right if you're fabricating. He didn't give me a monster. He gave me something worse. Something calculating. Something that spoke 2 words. And in those 2 words revealed more about its intelligence than 1,000 blurry photographs ever have. Costume, fun, 2 words. Think about what it took to produce them. And then think about how long it's been out there.
If you've had an encounter, anything, even something you've never told anyone because it sounded too strange, send it through this channel. I read every one, and if you're new here, consider subscribing. I put out new stuff every single week, and we are constantly going places in this research that nobody else is willing to go.